Are President Trump and Bill Gates trying to make money off of the coronavirus? Well, based on what I'm seeing on Twitter today, a lot of people seem to think so. For example, Ken Vogel, who's a journalist at the New York Times and normally a fairly reliable reporter, relatively speaking, obviously, says new, if hydroxychloroquine becomes an accepted coronavirus treatment, several companies stand to profit, some with shareholders and execs connected to Trump, all capital letters. Apparently it's like his hotels in these tweets. Trump himself has a small interest in Sanofi, which makes a brand name hydroxychloroquine version. This is part of a New York Times article about Trump's advocacy for the use of hydroxychloroquine, dividing the medical community, and it's literally here in this New York Times article. It's a remarkable statement. If hydroxychloroquine becomes an accepted treatment, several pharmaceutical companies stand to profit, including shareholders and senior executives with connection to the president. And Trump's interest in Sanofi, that company that makes Plaquenil, which is a brand name version of hydroxychloroquine. So basically, the New York Times is out there saying that Trump is trying to make money because he's recommending hydroxychloroquine. Really interesting. Kyle Griffin's out here, classic liberal hack, sharing the same stuff on Twitter. So you're seeing this is the narrative is being played in left-wing media. Literally, that President Trump is trying to make money off of recommending hydroxychloroquine. And as a corollary, there's another big theory out there, which is that Bill Gates is apparently trying to make money off of vaccines. Business Insider reports, as the basis for this speculation by others. Bill Gates is funding new factories for 7 potential coronavirus vaccines, even though it will waste billions of dollars. The basic concept here is that, he wants to mobilize faster, and he wanted to pick the top 7 vaccine candidates and build manufacturing capacity for all of them. And so that we actually have production ready when we, people figure out which vaccines are actually the best, which means that a lot of production capacity will ultimately be wasted. But, from Gates's point of view, that's a way to save money on net and save lives on net. That said, that hasn't left people thinking that this push by Bill Gates and essentially Tony Fauci downplaying hydroxychloroquine a little bit, isn't based in somehow a theory to make money. For example, John Cardio, a friend of mine, actually, says, bizarre how Dr. Destruction Fauci's resistance to hydroxychloroquine amps up exactly the same time his benefactor Bill Gates begins building coronavirus vaccine plants. Just a coincidence, I guess. And spelling it out more clearly, this is from April 4th, Fauci and company keep us under lockdown, the economy falls further, the capital flush Bill Gates can make investments in pharma companies that he can't because of the economic slowdown. Gates produces the eventual vaccine and makes billions more, and money flows back to Fauci and company. So that's sort of a speculative idea that Bill Gates is using the coronavirus pandemic and trying to keep strict lockdown measures in place in order to eventually make money off of pharmaceutical companies and vaccines. Further, this is the right Melissa. The reason why hydroxychloroquine is being rejected by the deep state is because it is a cheap and effective drug, so there's no money to be made. Fauci accepted $100 million from the Bill Gates Foundation, so he's paid to push the vaccine Bill Gates plans to make mandatory. So this is an interesting theory that Bill Gates would try and make everyone use a particular vaccine or that it would be mandatory. So we're going to analyze both of these things. But before we do that, time to recommend the channel Human Events on YouTube. We have just gotten started. We have about 5 daily videos. We started doing this just last week. If you're enjoying the content, if you have followed us before, if you followed me on Twitter, if you followed Ian Chong on Twitter, if you've done any of that, we would really appreciate it if you hit subscribe. You can't see it here because this is the homepage, but hit that subscribe button and you'll get notifications whenever we have a new video, which we intend to do a new one every day for as long as this lasts. Anyway, so let's talk about Trump and his massive investment and financial interest in hydroxychloroquine. Mike Cernovich, the journalist, author, filmmaker, reports on his own website and did a really simple analysis saying that Trump owns between $29 and $435 of Sanofi stock. His basis for saying this is that the specific Dodge and Cox's mutual fund, which is the one that owns part of Sanofi, that makes up less than $15,000 of his portfolio, and then within that less than $15,000. Sanofi makes up about 2.9%. Here it is. It's one of the largest holdings in the fund, but it's still only 2.9% of the fund. You can see that right here. So Cernovich points out that if Trump is on the high end of the disclosure range, all the way at $15,000, that would mean he has a $435 stake in Sanofi. Moreover, as Cernovich points out, hydroxychloroquine is off patent. It's one of the oldest malaria drugs in existence. It's been around since, I believe, the 50s. So it's not exactly a profit generator for any pharmaceutical company The profit generators are the drugs that are on patent, and therefore the drug company has a monopoly. Sanofi does not have a monopoly at making hydroxychloroquine. Anybody can make it. So it's the fact that the New York Times actually indulged this rank speculation and really utterly conspiratorial nonsense is ridiculous. And frankly, like, I'm going to rip into what I consider to be the inaccuracies about what Bill Gates is doing. But frankly, this is dumber than any of the speculation about Bill Gates. Like, it's the most ignorant thing to suggest that the president is recommending an off-patent drug to make money, right, for his own personal financial gain. It's just absurd that would be the case, right? Like, in reality, what does President Trump want? The economy to come back. Why? So he can be the president, so he has a better chance of winning in 2020, and so that the American people are better off, right? And we'll get into this, but maybe in the world of a pandemic, we should start by assuming that people's motivations are actually good, that they want to help their fellow Americans live and survive. I think that's a basic one. So let's the next thing I want to do is talk about Bill Gates. So, as we said, Bill Gates, people are suggesting, as John did, that Bill is trying to make money off of investing in pharmaceutical companies. And so let's think about, let's start with something like, what is Bill Gates' financial situation? Well, he's worth about $100 billion. And, kind of to start by understanding, what is he invested in, right? Like, how does his portfolio work? Well, this is based on the foundation that he runs, which has about $40 billion in assets. Its largest holding is Berkshire Hathaway. Okay, that's about $11 billion worth of Berkshire Hathaway. This is one of the largest companies in the S&P 500. Market cap of $560 billion, and it's unbelievably diversified, right? We're talking the company wholly owns, for example, Geico Insurance, Duracell Batteries, Dairy Queen Restaurant, BNSF, I think that's trains. Yeah, that's Burlington Northern Santa Fe. Lubrizol, what is that? Chemicals and transportation. Fruit of the Loom, underwear, diamonds. I mean, you look at NetJets, this is an unbelievably diverse company that has enterprises all over the American economy. So owning Berkshire Hathaway is, in a sense, owning a proxy of the entire American economy. And that's not all. What else does Bill Gates have in his portfolio? Waste management. That's trash, that's and environmental services and landfills. Canadian Railways. He owns a big railway stock. That's pretty tied to the economy. Caterpillar, construction, Walmart, which is actually doing well, unlike the rest of these. And you can kind of see what this means for Bill Gates' portfolio. What has the pandemic meant for it? Well, this is, kind of, again, you can kind of see this is the financial statements back at the end of 2018. You can see $11 billion in Berkshire Hathaway shares, and then I guess we'll zoom in a little bit so you can get a better view here also. And then maybe about $5 billion in the consumer goods sector, only $323 million in healthcare. It's actually one of the smallest. It's one of the smallest sectors that he's involved in terms of his own personal assets, or rather the trust's assets. Industrials are much bigger. Financials are much bigger. I mean, Bill Gates is extraordinarily diversified, and he's broadly invested in the American economy. What has coronavirus meant for Bill Gates and his philanthropy? Well, this is Guru Focus, so this isn't an official thing, but it's sort of a speculative notion about what he's holding, and I mean, they don't have current numbers on it, but this is a basic idea. One would assume that he's sort of similarly invested in 2020. How's that done? Bleeding red ink. Look at all that. Minus year-to-date change, all these are down 20%, all the way up to 50% on the year, and these are his top investments. Which brings me to a broader point. When people are trying to stop coronavirus, especially wealthy people, there's this incentive to come up with the ideas well, maybe they're trying to make money off the vaccines, right? But what if the reality is they just want to stall coronavirus because it's destroying their portfolio? Speaking as a person who is invested in the market, and probably a lot of you know this, your 401ks ain't doing that hot in the world of coronavirus. Everybody's down 20%. And when you're Bill Gates, being down 20% means a loss of about $20 billion in your net worth. And also a big loss in the financial stability of the philanthropy that you're doing. If the market comes back, all that gets solved. And think about it this way also. Think about how much money could you actually make from one of these companies, like a Sanofi. And I mean, the answer to that is not much, right? Part of the issue here is that when you're a Bill Gates with $100 billion, to make a single investment actually make that big a dent in your net worth is really challenging. It's not like that for smaller people. Think about, there aren't actually that many companies worth $100 billion, for example. And it becomes harder and harder to make meaningful investments in companies that actually change your economic fortunes that dramatically. From Bill Gates' perspective, some company like that's worth, I don't know, $10 billion becomes worth, 15 billion as a result of, making a vaccine. Well, then, and maybe he owns 10%. Well, that's an increase in his net worth of 1%. You know what would increase his net worth 20%? The market coming back. So understand that even if you think Bill Gates' motivation is selfish, which I don't really, I think he doesn't really care at the end of the day. He's about public health. The selfish motivation in terms of stopping a pandemic is not being able to make a little money off of the pharmaceutical companies, which again, as you know, his trust is not invested in very heavily. It's a very small portion of his overall portfolio. It looks like less than, am I reading that right? Yeah, less than 1% of his overall portfolio is in the healthcare sector. In the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Trust, which is the trust that funds all his philanthropy. That's not how he's going to make his money. He's going to make his money by the entire economy coming back. And he's going to be wealthier because of the entire economy coming back. So that argument just doesn't make sense. It's not based on how Bill Gates' finances work. But let's go to something a little more subtle. Somebody say maybe there's a political motivation here. And I actually want to make a point. We think about, like, Bill Gates I looked at Bill Gates' donations, and I mean, there's a lot of Democratic presidential candidates. So oddly, none who've actually won, or none who are still in the race. He really like Buttigieg, but no donation to Biden or Bernie. Think about all the billionaires that we criticize for, one, not stepping up to deal with coronavirus, and two, for spending money on causes that are very, very antithetical to the conservative movement. Things like George Soros trying to spend a huge amount of money to get European countries to take in refugees. Things like Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg spending huge amounts of money on either putting together a mailing list to impeach Trump, running for president, trying to donate to Democratic candidates all across the country, every town. Like, there are tons of billionaires out there who are genuinely spending money to be adversarial to conservatives. Bill Gates is not one of those guys. Like, he donates a little money to Democratic politicians, but relative to those guys, this is trivial. And he's focused on public health. I feel like there's a lot bigger fish we could be frying here than Bill Gates. Now, there's another theory out there from another friend of mine, Emerald Robinson. The idea being that the motivation of Gates isn't necessarily to make money, but to cement his broader control over public health. So this is actually a Twitter thread. The more you study this virus, the more you find the same name, Bill Gates. He's the second largest funder of the WHO. He's building 7 vaccine labs. Fauci, Tedros, Event 201, ID 2020. He basically controls global health policy. What's the plan? Using vaccines to track people. So that's pretty aggressive. In 2017, Gates' sway over the WHO was so obvious that even liberals were worried. And this Politico article said that academics have coined a term for his sway in global health, the Bill chill. People don't criticize him. He's very interested in vaccines because the government can mandate that. Why? Because governments can mandate that people get them. And if vaccines include microchips and you have worldwide surveillance, that explains his interest in quantum dot tattoos. So, like, vaccines to get microchips in people for global surveillance. And then, what is a quantum dot tattoo? There's an article, I've looked in all these things. And then finally, he's looking to, his company Microsoft has launched a worldwide digital identity campaign to leverage immunization to establish digital identity worldwide. And that is the end of democracy. So let's go through these things one by one, understanding what Gates is doing. So why did this Politico article come out? Well, this Politico article came out and talks about the world's most powerful doctor. And one of the things in particular is that there seems to be a very clear dispute between certain people at the WHO about what Gates should be doing and what the WHO's priorities should have been back in 2017. As it says here, the results, say his critics, is that Gates' priorities have become the WHO's rather than focusing on strengthening healthcare in poor countries that would help in their view to contain future outbreaks like the Ebola epidemic. The agency spends a disproportionate amount of its resources on projects with the measurable outcomes Gates prefers, such as the effort to eradicate polio. Well, I mean, there's two problems with this. One, it does look like Gates has been talking about pandemic preparation for some time. He did a TED Talk back in 2015 saying we're not ready for the next global pandemic. That TED Talk aged quite well. But the second thing is that, it's saying is that Gates is kind of thinking about effective altruism. He wants his donations and health money to be spent on, objectives that we could accomplish and that are good. So, for example, on polio, I mean, this is actually really interesting. I hadn't really thought about this. Over the past 3 decades, the world has made tremendous progress towards the eradication of polio. In 1988, the virus was present in 125 countries and paralyzing 350,000 people every year. But since then, immunization efforts and vaccines have reduced the number of cases by 99%, and there are only 3 countries where polio exists, and there were fewer than 40 cases reported globally. So what we're on the verge of doing with polio is pretty amazing, actually, when you think about it. We're about on the verge of doing with that what we did with smallpox. If you guys forget, smallpox was a disease that ravaged the world for hundreds of years and was the cause of and millions of deaths and tons of epidemics. And one of the great accomplishments of global public health is that smallpox has been eradicated. It now exists only in labs. There are no human beings infected with smallpox in the world right now. None. And we're close to getting that with polio. That is a valid and valiant goal and because if you eradicate it, it ain't coming back. Right now we've massively squeezed it. We haven't gotten rid of it. If we eradicate it, that's a good thing. Polio really, polio paralyzed Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's even in 1980 it was still paralyzing tons of young people. I mean, it's eliminatable. This is something I think it's very a virtuous thing for Bill Gates and his foundation to be focused on. So maybe there was, people upset that the WHO was following Gates, but it's not. This seems like an internal squabble over what the priorities should be back in 2017, and somebody just throwing oppo to Politico to try and say nasty things about Bill Gates. I'm just not really impressed with this particular argument as a reason why Bill Gates is so much in control. But I don't think Emerald's necessarily using it that way. I think Emerald's using it, to talk about like what is he trying to do with vaccines. And so she linked to this article from Rice about quantum dot tattoos, which is the first time I've heard about them. But I'm trying to get a handle. So I tried to get a handle on like what is Gates trying to accomplish here. It talks about these tattoos that can be applied, very, very small, like 1.5 millimeters tattoos that contain vaccine information about whether or not people have been vaccinated and why are they interested in it. It says quote here. This is I think the doctor Kevin McHugh who's talking about it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation came to us and said, hey, we have a real problem knowing who's vaccinated. They said, we go on vaccination campaigns where people get into Hummers, drive to a rural village, set up a tent and start immunizing people, but they don't always know who's been immunized before, what vaccines are still needed. Parents don't often know their children's vaccination histories. So our idea was to put the record on the person. Later on, people can scan over the area to see what vaccines have been administered and give only the ones still needed. I mean, here's the thing about this. This makes perfect sense to me. And I think it's even from a perspective where you have vaccines have these negative side effects, this should still be something people see as laudable, especially in the developing world where you have like plenty. This is not the same, information infrastructure, not the same economic or public health infrastructure. And there's so much public aid going in that people might be getting multiple of the same vaccine that they don't need. And if like there are some, that seems like risky and unnecessary. And the point of this is in those places, that's where you might use something like a nano tattoo where records are bad, information is bad, and you might want to be able to prevent somebody from getting a vaccine. In here, there's no indication that what Bill Gates is thinking is, we will make all 7 billion people in the world get nano tattoos. There's literally that's completely speculative and doesn't make sense based on what Gates' motivations are. And I mean, if you look at his own website, what are they talking about in terms of how he's spending his money? Well, they're talking about typhoid vaccines and rotavirus vaccines, a new oral polio vaccine, tuberculosis potentially having a vaccine for that. They're thinking about, and most of this stuff, this is developing world trying to prevent people from dying from preventable diseases that we don't die from anymore in the United States, but they're still dying from there. That's the motivation here, and that's also the motivation behind this ID 2020 thing. I'd never heard of that either, but I was reading about it. The idea that identity is a human right and that individuals must have ownership over their own identity. And it's talking about if you can't prove who you are, then there's a whole bunch of independent problems you have getting access to like government benefits. You can't do it. I mean, we have this problem in the United States when it comes to voting, right? Like there's the whole like, should you have voter ID? I believe you should have voter ID, but you can understand that not having ID, being unable to prove who you are, means you can't fly in a plane, you can't do, there's so many different things you can't do if you don't have the ability to prove that. So they're just trying to expand. This seems like a project that's just trying to expand access to it. Right. Quote, here it says here, quote, over 1 billion people worldwide are unable to prove their identity through any recognized means. As such, they are without the protection of the law and unable to access basic services, participate as a citizen, or transact in the modern economy. Most of those affected are children and adolescents, and many are refugees, forcibly displaced, or stateless persons. Think about what it would be like to just not have papers, right? To not have a driver's license or a passport or a birth certificate and be unable to get one. That's a dramatically life-altering experience, and it's one we just take for granted that it wouldn't happen. But in many places in the world, it does. And they're thinking about the ways to do this in a way that makes sure that everybody owns their own data. And right now, to think about this and be like Microsoft is being evil by trying to accomplish this and give people privacy and ownership of their own data when there are companies like Google and Facebook that own your data already and use it to make money. And they're talking about giving you control of your data, making it protecting it, cryptographically so that you have control of it. And this is somehow the conspiracy theory that Bill Gates is trying to accomplish with vaccines. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. There's so much here about like what Bill Gates is trying to accomplish. I mean, people are being, I think, just really wrong, and making, extrapolating from very, very weak evidence about what Bill Gates's goals are. I think they're really pretty simple. I think Bill Gates is worth $100 billion. The dude doesn't need money. He doesn't care about it that much. And if you think he does, the way he gets his money back is by solving a pandemic. I think ultimately Bill Gates is genuinely public spirited in this effort. That's what he's trying to accomplish. He's not trying to make money off some random pharmaceutical company who makes vaccines. It would be so trivial in the context of his portfolio compared to what would happen if the economy came back that he's not really thinking about it. The real question for somebody like Gates is, how can I use my wealth to save lives, right? I have more money that I could spend in a million lifetimes. In a million lifetimes, how can I use it to help others? And it seems like that's why he's willing to spend billions on like 7 different vaccine plants in the hopes that one of them will work. And there's another point, too, that people say, like, oh, he's going to sell these vaccines at a profit. That doesn't make sense either. Like, remember, think about all the people demanding that the government make the vaccines free or be sold at cost. Like, there's no way a billionaire could get away with monopolizing a vaccine like that. The government would seize it. Trump would use the Defense Production Act. Like, there's so many things that even if Bill Gates had a nefarious plan to make billions of dollars off of a coronavirus vaccine, the governments would not let him do it. They would invoke the Defense Production Act. They would force him to sell them the vaccine at cost. It just wouldn't work. So this is not an area where Bill Gates is going to make a ton of money. It's certainly a lot harder than making money off of things like Berkshire Hathaway and Microsoft, which still is running the entire global economy. The stories just don't make sense. And so I think to kind of bring it back together, what you're seeing with both President Trump and Bill Gates is this habit of looking at and thinking, being super skeptical and thinking nobody acts in a public spirited way, and everybody's acting in their own personal selfish interests. And therefore they're looking out for their personal, like a very, very specific corrupt financial interest. In reality, the thing about a pandemic, and especially how a pandemic affects rich people, it demolishes their portfolios. And they have to watch their fellow Americans go through a problem that they have the capacity to solve. Trump wants hydroxychloroquine being used by doctors because he thinks it works. Very simple. He wants to help save Americans' lives. He wants to get America back to work, and he wants to help the economy. Bill Gates is trying to make vaccines work because he wants to save American lives. He wants to get his economy back as soon as possible, and he wants to go back to doing normal philanthropic work. Like, from a selfish perspective, the most important thing for both of them is to get the economy back running. And from a public spiritedness perspective, there is a profound desire among people at that level to like genuinely use their wealth to improve the world. Not everybody is massively cynical. And if there are cynical billionaires out there who are really doing harm, they're people like Soros, they're people like Steyer and Bloomberg who are selfishly using their resources to try and meddle with politics. Like, it's not what Gates is doing. And I think that it's really ridiculous that we're putting him in that box. Anyway. Again, if you've reached the end, thank you so much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. Again, we are new here. Please hit subscribe so that you get access to our channel and share these things out. We're just getting going, and I think that you'll really like what we have coming in terms of new things. Thanks, guys.